Welcome to a Family Weekend Classic. This historical tour of campus is a program that we do every year at Family Weekend, and we're proud to have it here this year at Ram Fam Weekend. This year it's virtual. My name is Lexi McCarthy. I'm the Director of Parent and Family Relations. We're thrilled you've chosen to join us this afternoon. Throughout the session, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. We will address questions at the end of the session. If anything isn't answered, we will be sure to get those answers to you. You can always email parentfamilyrelations@wcupa.edu. Without further ado, please join me in welcome Dr. Ann Krylkowski, who's a professor in the history department and our very own Westchester historical expert, who was actually recently featured on KYW News discussing women's rights and the 19th Amendment. So thank you, Dr. Krylkowski, for being here, and take it away.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here to present the tour. Thank you all for taking the time to join me. As Alexis said, I teach in the history department, and one of my special interests is the built environment and the social and cultural history of architecture. And I've been researching the history of the campus, actually, particularly the serpentine stone buildings that many of you might have seen in person, since I was in graduate school when I used the campus for a graduate project. So it's an ongoing interest of mine. So let me advance to the slide. So we're going to look today at the expansion of the campus and how the physical campus really reflects the evolution of the school. When I do the walking tour, and here you can see the original Old Main from an early advertisement from the 1870s, which shows how undeveloped the section of the borough that the university is located in was at that time. It really was a little bit of farmland on the southern tip of the borough. And you see the historical center of the quad in the colored photo on the right-hand side. What I'm going to be mainly focusing on is what I do in the walking tour, which is the historic quad. Years ago, another history professor wrote a National Register nomination, which was granted. So the historic quad has National Register status because of its significance in the history of education and the history of architecture. So it's really a great kind of treasure house that we have right here on campus. But since you are lucky enough actually to take the Zoom tour, I'll be able to show you some images of buildings that don't exist anymore, like the image of Old Main that you see on the left, and intersperse a few images of students along the way to give you a sense of the different eras of the school, which of course we can't do when it's a walking tour. So the school, or the physical campus, really develops as the school develops and in the same stages. So Westchester at first was a normal school for the First District of Pennsylvania, and that was a very long period of its history. And then the state converted the normal schools into teachers' colleges, although during that period they had to face a lot of national challenges like Depression and World War II, which hampered their growth quite a bit. And then after the prosperity of the 50s, we expanded into a liberal arts program along with teacher education. And then as a university since 1983 have developed a very robust graduate program and many other types of majors and disciplines that no one ever thought of in the 19th century when the school was a normal school. So the campus really reflects these four different eras as the school grows in the number of students, but also adds different majors for students to study. Now, I like to start the walking tour at this doorway, which students always tell me they think looks very strange and out of place, but it is the Old Main doorway. Actually, let me scroll back very briefly. So the image that you see on the left here was the original campus, and that was typical for normal schools to start out as one building. So the doorway from that building was saved when the building was demolished, something I will talk about, and then it was reconstructed in the 1990s, pretty close to where it stood originally. So this doorway, the doorway to the original main hall, was the doorway to the school. and the campus. All the classrooms, the dorm rooms, the teacher offices were in this building. And I like the symbolism of how it still symbolically provides an entrance to the school. Now, a really important part of Westchester's history, even though the normal school began in 1871, was its antecedent in the Westchester Academy. And this is something that school catalogs still include every year when they provide a brief discussion of the school's history. And I think for two reasons, it's very important to mention this connection, because it gave Westchester Normal School some unique characteristics for a normal school. The borough of Westchester liked to think of itself as a little Athens. Before there were public schools, the borough had 9 or 10 private academies. Some were for girls and some were for boys. And the Westchester Academy was one of the most successful and prestigious, and it was an academy for boys, and it was well known for its rigorous academic standards. So the trustees of the Westchester Academy were very proud of their reputation and what they achieved with the school. They were, as you can see here, running a school for a long time, since about the era of the War of 1812. But during the Civil War, it went downhill very quickly because all the boys left to join the Union cause, which was a good thing. But it left the trustees in a bit of a quandary. So for a brief period, they turned the school into a military academy to help the Union cause, but also to keep the school going. And so they instituted military drills and fitness programs. And I've seen in their trustee minutes that they thought the fitness drills were very good and a very good complement to the academic side of things. And that's very important to remember, because the Westchester School, unlike most of the other state normal schools, will very early on create a specialty out of health and physical fitness, which the school is still known for today. And that comes from that Westchester Academy history. But after the Civil War, they really kind of are never able to really get the school going as well as they had before. So they look around for other opportunities. And right before the Civil War, the state of Pennsylvania had passed the Normal School Act of 1857. As more and more Pennsylvanians were interested in gaining more education, what became a widespread social cause or concern was the education of teachers. So normal schools were created to provide more substantial education for teachers who are coming to have a greater influence in Pennsylvania and American society in general. The idea of a normal school comes from France, from the École Normale, which, as far as I've been able to find out, was the very first school in the Western world that was dedicated to the education of teachers. And the name comes from the fact that elementary or primary school teachers are training students in cultural norms and the values and behaviors of society. So a normal school was to teach students the norm, and a normal school was to train elementary school teachers. So from the Westchester Academy to the normal school, the trustees decided to end the academy. They sold off the building that you see here, and they put the proceeds in founding the normal school in 1870 and 1871. And here you see the charter from 1871, when the state certified the normal school at Westchester to serve the first district of Pennsylvania. The Normal School Act divided Pennsylvania into 12 districts, plus Philadelphia, which was its own district. And the first district included Chester County, Delaware County, Montgomery, and Bucks. And people in any town or community in those 4 counties could have acted to create the normal school. From what I've researched and found out, I believe that Westchester became the seat of the normal school simply because the trustees of the academy were already interested in education, had a history of managing a school, and as soon as they sold the school, they had the assets to do it. So Westchester became the seat of the normal school for the first district. In the map, you can see the early development of the school. The section or the property, the block with all of the blue buildings, represents the normal school at the end of the normal era by the 1920s. The Normal School Act required then a normal school, or trustees who wanted to start a normal school, have a minimum of 10 acres because they anticipated that the normal schools would be highly successful and continue to expand. And certainly, as you see from all of the buildings that are drawn in blue, you can see that the normal school at Westchester was incredibly successful from the get-go, actually. So the property with most of the blue buildings represents that first 10-acre plot that the trustees acquired from a local businessman. And then eventually they bought the lot next door across Church Street, which is designated in pink, where Wayne Field is listed. And they use this for athletic fields as sports became more important. And then eventually you see the blue building there. They built a boys' dorm, which was the first time a dorm was built not on the original property. So the buildings you see here in blue from the normal school era really represent that historic core that's on the National Register. So I'm going to show you how those buildings really reflected the early history of the school. So this is Maine, the original building in a postcard and also in a photograph from the 1890s showing some of the students milling around. Some of the very young students that you see in front were from the model school, which I'll also talk about in a few minutes. So the building was a very lavish kind of state-of-the-art building for the 1870s. It's in the Second Empire style, which was very expensive to build because the roof was complicated. You had to have experienced workers, and it was very time-consuming labor. So they clearly wanted to build a building that would gain attention and really forecast their anticipation that their school was going to be a remarkable school very quickly. However, they were worried about the budget. And I've seen in their meeting minutes that they told the architect, Addison Hutton from Philadelphia, they asked him, could you design a school that would look very attractive, but we could add to over time and it wouldn't look unbalanced? So this would allow them to add to the school as the student body grew, but also it was very practical because it allowed them to pay for the school in stages rather than laying out all the money at once. And so what was built first was the center part with the cupola, and you can kind of see the doorway under the tree branch, and then the two wings that are kind of set back. That was the original part of the school. But much more quickly than the trustees anticipated, by the early 1880s, in just 10 years, they had to add the north wing, and they turned that into a boys' dorm. And then they added the south wing a few years later, which was the girls' dorm. At first, boys slept on the third floor and girls slept on the fourth floor. Single faculty, as well as the principal and his family, also lived in Main Hall. So they were all there to keep an eye on the students. If you think of what a kerfuffle co-ed dorms caused in the 1970s, but right from the beginning, boys and girls were housed in the same building. And that was typical of normal schools. So here's a normal school dorm room. The rooms were designed for 4 students, although you only see 3 here. And I've talked to some alumni who lived in the dorm in the 1960s, just a few years before the building was demolished. And they said 4 students slept in the rooms, but they considered them to be quite crowded for 4 students. But here you see just 3. And I always laugh when I see this picture. You see 2 doorways. One went to the hallway, of course. The other one was for a closet. And I've seen in the meeting minutes, the trustees, you know, as construction projects do, the expenses started mounting up beyond the original estimates. And so at one point, the building committee for the trustees said, let's tell the architect to take out all the closets. That'll save labor and money. And so they did. Luckily, a more practical trustee looked at the plans and apparently told the other trustees, if you think in this day and age that 4 young persons who are almost adults can share a room without a closet, you will find yourself sadly mistaken and you will not have any students. So they decided to add closets back to the room plans. And I've even seen in early advertisements for the school, they list closets as one of the amenities that the dorm rooms hold. So clearly they felt the closets were a bit of an expense, but I'm sure these students were appreciative of having closets. And of course the rooms weren't electrified until almost the turn of the century. And they had outhouses, and they used chamber pots for the first few years. So the technology was not what students are used to in their dorm rooms today. Now, Main Hall was expanded as much as they could expand it. In addition to adding a north wing and a south wing, they built a huge rear wing in the center and got as much use out of that building as they possibly could. But the sports program and the fitness were expanding. So the very next building they added was a gymnasium in 1890 beside Old Main. And this also was built out of the local serpentine stone, as you see in this postcard. And this also was a state-of-the-art building. They sent the architect around to look at Harvard's. Yale was currently building a gymnasium, and to look at all the largest and most recent college gymnasiums in the country. And this, they believed, except for Harvard's, was the largest when it was built. It didn't have a pool, but it had a wading pool for aquatic exercise. And you can see the fitness class from 1907 and the gym team, and then the girls' basketball team from 1913. Sports became very popular. Both the female and the male students had a number of sports clubs: baseball, gym, gymnastics, basketball. But the boys started having teams around 1900. And I am sad to say, since I am a tennis player, that the girls were not supported by the school and didn't actually have intercollegiate sports until the late 1950s. But the boys began playing intercollegiate sports early in the 20th century. But clearly, since the girls had many sports clubs, as you see here, they definitely wanted to play sports. And the school did support their activities in that way, believing fitness was very important. The next building that was added was the principal's house. Green Gables, also in serpentine stone. All of the buildings, with one exception, up to the 1920s, were built of this green stone. This campus and the University of Pennsylvania, which the first 4 buildings were built out of serpentine stone, were the only 2 that were like this. So they very much represented an era of this kind of trendy stone at the time. A lot of millionaires used this stone because it was something that was very new. Even in Chicago and Boston, it was very popular for a period of time. Until Principal Phillips moved into Green Gables, he and his wife and children lived in the main dorm. In fact, his children, I think the oldest was about 12, had never lived anywhere else but in the dorms. So I'm sure they were delighted to have a house of their own. But the Westchester trustees supported a very active lecture program that they paid for themselves, that the state did not support, and brought a lot of famous people to campus, including Frederick Douglass, the former slave and abolitionist. Booker T. Washington was another guest, Theodore Roosevelt, and all of these men were entertained at Green Gables in the principal's house. And then the next building added to campus was Recitation Hall. This also was built of green stone, which more recently has been restored. And a recitation building was a classroom building, as you see here. And the man in the photograph, who is the teacher standing up, is Samuel Schmucker, for whom he was a long-term science teacher. And in the 1960s, the Smucker Science Complex was named after him for his long service here. But Recitation Hall also provided some rooms for day students, because by the 1890s, the school had some more commuters, or what were called day students at the time. So that was a new feature of that building, and that was on the quad on the Church Street side. So we're beginning to have a quad now as new buildings are added to the campus. But also the need for all of these classrooms shows that the school was growing very much. By the 1890s, the trustees were having to turn down a lot of students simply because they didn't have enough dorm rooms and there weren't enough places to find off-campus housing in the borough. So moving all the classrooms to Recitation Hall allowed them to turn as much of Main Hall into dorm rooms as they could, so that they could accept the students who wanted to gain an education. And then the model school was another building that was built during the building campaign of the 1890s. And this also was built of serpentine stone. It's also on the quad. The model school was crucial to a teacher training school. Originally, there were model classrooms in Old Main, but the school, because it had to provide student teaching experience for all of the seniors, could only accept enough students for whom they could guarantee student teaching. So building a separate model school allowed them to expand this grade school, which served as an elementary school for local residents who lived in the borough and farmers who lived around outside of the town, and allowed them to accept more teacher training students. Before cars, the students had to do their student training on campus because they couldn't get around to local schools to do that. The model school taught the regular academic subjects that elementary school students would be taught at the time or even today, but they had courses like basket weaving, as you see here, which were, according to the theories of John Dewey, develop motor skills and eye-hand coordination. So there was also attention to that kind of development on the part of the school. And the model school very much followed the ideas of philosopher John Dewey. And in the 1960s or early 1970s, the school was named Ruby Jones Hall in honor of Ruby Jones, who you see here third from the, left. Ruby Jones was the first Black teacher on campus. She was the third grade teacher in the model school, and a few years after this picture was taken, she was promoted to a professor and began overseeing student teachers who were going out to local schools to do their student teaching. So she was the first African-American professor on campus and was very popular. And there was a widespread movement after she retired to have a building named after her. So the model school was eventually named, as it still is, Ruby Jones Hall. So they're the model school teachers, or demonstration school as it was called in the 60s that time. And then, of course, a very important addition to the campus, one of the last buildings added during this period. And I should point out, actually, before moving on, that all of these buildings added during the 1890s is very significant because the United States, and particularly the Philadelphia area, suffered a very severe depression with a lot of unemployment. And it was a huge era for the school's expansion, that they had a need to build all of these buildings during that time while the country was suffering a depression, really shows at the time of their 25th anniversary how successful the school was to have all that building going on in that decade. So the library was, of course, a major addition to the school. And still, this is a recent picture from the website of just a beautiful building. And although people look at the serpentine stone as being very Victorian, because by the turn of the century, it really, the more things are popular, the quicker people turn against them when something new comes along. And so they very quickly looked old-fashioned to many people. But you can see from the pediment and the ionic columns that the architect who designed this building was designing a very classical style of building. And the interior of the original is just extraordinary. I would give anything to be able to walk into this building. This was all ripped out in the 1930s in an effort to make it more modern, which I think, this is just my opinion, it's not endorsed by the school or anybody else, but I just think it's a shame that all of these columns in this beautiful space were torn out. But I guess part of it is a positive sign, because the book collection was growing. The need for more space for students to do work in the library was one of the reasons. So it was made to expand the library. The Chester County Historical Society and the Museum of Art and Natural History objects that the school owned were on the second floor. So the school always had a very close connection with the borough by hosting the Chester County Historical Society. Borough residents were invited to lectures and musical performances. And when the gym was opened, that I showed you in 1890, there were open periods where borough residents were allowed to come and use the fitness facilities. So always very much a close connection, I think, between the school and the borough. But this is what the library, and you can see very classical, rather than the Victorian buildings you've seen so far. And then the school was not only building on that original property, but because it was expanding so much, it started buying in the 1890s and the first years of the 20th century adjacent properties for future and for current expansion. And one of the needs, which we can all relate to now, was the need for an infirmary and a quarantine quarters, because in the late 19th century and the early 20th, there were many epidemics. They didn't last as long as our COVID-19 is lasting, but there were many years where the school opened a month late or closed a month early, or hurriedly during the school year had to send students home for a few weeks. And this lasted all the way up into World War II. And so they had to build a quarantine hospital that was situated a little bit away from the rest of the school. So they purchased a property on South High Street below Rosedale, and an athletic field. So it's where the girls' sports clubs were able to practice near the quarantine hospital. Notice not the boys. But this was the first infirmary for the school. And because epidemics were so common during this period, they very quickly included the infirmary and the notice that the quarantine station was away from the rest of the school in their advertising, because it was very important. That's another reason why they emphasized fitness at the normal school, because teachers were considered to be particularly exposed in the classrooms and public schools to all these epidemics and contagious diseases. And it was believed that teachers had to be particularly robust and fit in order to resist a lot of these diseases. So that was an added reason for having a mandatory exercise and a fitness program. This building was built out of brick, not out of the serpentine stone. Next to it, you can kind of see the roof line of the property that would become Tanglewood, which the school would purchase a little later, and eventually became the president's house. It's where the president lives today. And then they also purchased the property, if you remember the map I showed you, they purchased the county agricultural fields west of Church Street, just adjacent to the rest of the campus, as the boys' athletic fields, but also as a park and for tennis courts and croquet grounds. And this is where the boys' clubs and then the boys' track teams and baseball teams played sports. And they attracted big crowds. This is before television, before a lot of, I guess there were professional baseball teams and around by 1917, but a lot of people couldn't go see them. So college and high school sports were very popular with spectators. And this was named Wayne Field because it had been Wayne Campground during the Civil War, named after Anthony Wayne, who was the only Revolutionary War general from Chester County. And here's a picture of the baseball team from 1917. They started having a team right around the turn of the century. And you can see one of the players is a young Black man. The school year, there really aren't many photographs of students before 1910. There are a few, but they're usually group photographs, and it's very difficult to see the students very well. The first yearbook is published in 1910, and there is several young Black students in that yearbook. So they're the first documented Black students who attended the school. Although I've seen articles written by NAACP lawyers who say that there were Black students attending the Westchester Normal School in the 1890s, but so far I haven't been able to find any paperwork or documentation of that. But in the yearbooks and the teens, we see them a few of them joining clubs, and particularly participating in the sports teams and some of the musical groups during this era. And then finally, before World War I, the first building, other than the infirmary, is built on a property that is not the original property. And this is the boys' dorm on Wayne Field. And it wasn't that there were this many boys attending the school, but there were so many girls who wanted to attend the school. Moving the boys to a separate dorm allowed even more girls to live in Old Main. And allow the student to accept more of them. And then you can see these students are from the late teens. They look a little older. The college students at the time, well, at the normal school, had a much wider age range than college students tend to today, although certainly we do have continuing eds on campus. But at the early normal school, students as young as 14 and 15 came, because normal schools also served as high schools before a lot of communities had a high school. And then because of the expense of college, just like today, students often had to work or save money before they could come to school. So there would also be students in their 20s who were coming back, finally able to get a degree. And so this is the campus as it looked by the end of the normal school era. You can see most of the buildings on the original property, except for that last Wayne Hall, the boys' dorm, which is near the boys' sports field across Church Street. And you can get a sense of how treed the lovely tree cover of the campus has always been. By the end of the normal school, as you see in this alumni dinner picture, the school had almost 10,000 alumni who had attended the school. And Westchester was known as one of the most successful normal schools in the United States. It was often written up in national publications. But then it enters its era as a state teachers college, which was a very important move. Many people wanted it to be converted to a liberal arts school, but the state of Pennsylvania was not willing to spend money to hire more teachers for the normal schools. So it decided to start offering degrees, but to focus still just on the training of teachers. But there were people at Westchester, and particularly President Swope, who was hired in the early 1930s, who always believe that the school is restricted by that there are many young Pennsylvanians who want a college education who don't want to become teachers. They want to go into other careers. So they are always straining against state restrictions to provide more programs and advanced classes for students who come to school here. So the school did add a few buildings, although during this era, as I've already noted, they had to face Depression and World War. So Phillips Memorial Auditorium is a Grand Gothic school, Grand Gothic building. Normal schools didn't usually have Gothic architecture like colleges and universities. So this was the first big Gothic building. And you can see it from the street. The gateway to the school, the architect designed it, but then the two wings on either side of the gate kind of embrace the historic quad from the interior of the school. And it has a lot of notable features, decorative features, figures from medieval and Greek philosophy and heraldry that were marvels to people in the borough. And then they also added another gymnasium as the fitness program started. They added this right before the Depression became very bad. And for that reason, although it was originally intended to have a swimming pool, the swimming pool was cut out. So the state required fitness, health, and physical education majors to take 4 semesters of swimming, and the school did not have a pool. So they had to use the YMCA in town. This gym was named after the Ehingers, Clyde and Ella, who developed the fitness program in the early 1890s, and like many professors during that era, taught for 30 and 35 years at the school. And they retired in the early 1920s, but they did come back for the dedication. So this is their picture. And then Anderson was added right before World War I. I have yet to find a really great image that shows this big sprawling building. For a year, the history department had our offices in here, and we used to talk about it at our department meetings. We just loved walking in and out of this building. It made you feel like a college professor to be walking in and out of these arches. But this also was a state-of-the-art building and was fully wired for the radio, which, remember, was pretty new. A lot of people only got radio and electricity in the 1930s. And I've read that in 1941, a lot of the students and faculty gathered here that famous morning to listen to the Day of Infamy speech by FDR. And a few years ago, I actually had a woman who was on the tour who said that her father was one of those students and always told that story. And then he finished out the spring semester and then enlisted and went off to fight in World War II. So that must have been a momentous morning for this building. But the school was very proud, and the students were very proud to have the campus quad. They paraded around, and things were changing, of course. By the 1920s, we see female students' legs show up in the yearbooks. By 1926 and 27, and bobbed hair. And then the African-American students who are in the school become more visible. The College Club was created in the 1930s by and for the Black education students. So this is one of their images from the yearbook. And during World War II, for the first time, Black female students were allowed to live in the campus dorms. Before that, neither male or female Black students were able to, which living on campus surely helped them participate more in the extracurricular activities. So times were changing for the school. And then the GI Bill brought many more young men to campus. Although if you look closely at the photograph of the GIs here, you see that some of them were indeed women who were also veterans of World War II. But it also highlighted to President Swope what he had already thought, because many of these GIs wanted a college education. They didn't necessarily want to become teachers. And a lot of them were frustrated at not being able to. So school leaders had been working even before the war broke out to free the school from the restrictions of being a teacher's college only, and started adding more advanced classes for secondary education majors. And President Swope really took advantage of post-war prosperity and the influx of young men, along with some of the other state teachers' colleges in the state, to really begin pressing the state legislature to convert the schools into liberal arts schools, to serve the needs of a broader segment of the young people of Pennsylvania. So this really changes the school, and for the first time starts to bring the number of female and male students more into equal numbers. And so people become afraid. There's forecasts that there's going to be what they call an enrollment tidal wave is going to hit the school as the baby boomers start to reach college age. And so the Swope administration begins planning another huge campaign to reshape the campus and add more dorms and more buildings to serve the post-war baby boomers as they come to college campuses. So the school is dramatically reshaped during this period. Unfortunately, in my opinion, Grand Old Main is demolished, as you see here, although even the people who work in preservation for the federal government come up and protest, preservationists, the artist Andrew Wyeth, and even many of the students. Some of the college administrators are afraid that the old green buildings look old-fashioned and students aren't going to like them. But students, as they record in the newspapers, the student publications, they loved the old buildings. They thought they were really special and that it set the campus apart from other campuses. So a lot of them, I'm happy to say, were quite sad to see Old Main demolished. But as you see from the image on the right, students who attended Westchester in the 1960s and the 1970s got used to going to classes on what became an almost constant construction site, as several buildings were knocked down, but many buildings were erected, particularly dormitories. And this original college property was really packed, as full as it could be, with buildings. And as you can see, a lot of the new buildings, or the great majority of them, were in the typical mid-century style. And of course, because of the explosion in the college population, the dormitories were all high-rise buildings, just like were appearing in cities at the time. And then New Main, which stands today and replaced Old Main, you can see on the left-hand side in the upper image, which is 5 stories with a low auditorium beside it, right on the quad, a library, a student union building, a new dining hall, which is the first time the dining hall and the kitchens are away from the student dorm rooms, which you can imagine how worrying that was because of fire, the chance of fire. But this really brings a different look to college campuses, not just Westchester, in the 1960s with that style. And you can see the school, as you can see in the map, becomes very densely built. And so the school purchases a farm south of Westchester, and that becomes South Campus, which becomes the center of the expanded fitness center, now called Stursbecker Hall. And then in the 1980s and 1990s, the school for the first time builds campus housing and kind of suburban style dormitories down on South Campus. So that is a period of great expansion for the school. The school also has classes off campus in business parks for the first time because the campus is becoming so crowded and so many students want a chance to attend class. And then even more recently, and even as we speak, if we were walking around campus today, we would see this building currently in the course of construction, the Engineering and University Commons building, which reflects, again, the expansion of programs with the new biomedical engineering program that is going to begin in a year or two, along with more cafeterias and common buildings for students. So the evolution of the school, even during COVID, continues. And we certainly see this reflected in the campus buildings along the way. So thank you very much. I'd be happy if, I think there might be a few minutes left if anybody has any questions on the chat.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so I just want to thank you, and thank you to our attendees for joining. If you have any questions that you think of as you continue on your day, we'd love to have them. You can email us at parentandfamilyrelations@westchesterwcupa.edu. I also have a recording of this that we'll provide out. Thank you to Dr. Kulikowski for allowing us to record today.
Thank you. Enjoy the day and the weekend.